cause of these lies is left to our own powers of intuition and reasoning to realize that, well, heck, these are the only things that could have happened in the end of this thing. So, is it conducive to us to merely say, "Oh, you can't tell lies" or something like this, when the conditions which are terminal, nonetheless, no matter who lies about them? I mean, what would the opposite case be? I mean, suppose the president and everyone beneath him in the executive branch, and everyone in the judicial branch, and everyone in the congressional branch of our government. Suppose they all admitted that this system was terminal. We would have the exact same situation. That of its consequences, unless they did something about it, and that something happened to be the only thing which resolves all these issues and eliminates the need for these guys to cover their derrieres by lying about things which people that possess bad debts and yet are responsible to repay those debts by a process which requires a public which has been made, an unwitting public which has been made irresponsible to pay those debts. This in turn renders this peripheral bank or further entity unable to service the artificial escalation of debt which it's subject to, owing itself to this obfuscation of the currency. So these questions are just scratching the surface of this, and the misleading thing about their minimal depth is that it's focusing on issues which we can see are obviously wrong, but to think that we could resolve them somehow by simply, regulating banking or regulating the sales of these, eventually terminal insoluble debts, is preposterous. We're not even bringing to the fore the issues which we need to resolve into solution here. So, we have to dig a lot deeper than this. And I mean, while this seems to be, and it's a very well done, investigation, documentary of the events here, but it's only well done in respect to the depth and breadth of the investigation, which is not just hampered, it's obstructed from achieving the real objectives of the people by its lack of understanding of this terminal nature of this obfuscation of the currency. So, I would have liked, to have participated in this, and it would have made it a completely different event to expose all these crimes in their full fledged breadth and depth. That is, what do they emanate from? Why are we suffering all this? How can these things, these investment banks possibly serve us in any way? Why should we believe that we are better off if their liquidity is improved by 12 private corporations which have imposed this obfuscation of the currency upon us merely for the sake of exploitation by a process which is inevitably terminal. I mean, how can we benefit from any of this, much less the mere downstream ramifications of this at the time of its terminal failure, which we could have avoided 40 years ago if we simply listened as responsible people would have?
Governor Fred Mishkin is resigning effective August 31. He says he plans to return to his teaching post at Columbia's Graduate School of Business.
Why did you leave the Federal Reserve in August of 2008? I'm in the middle of the worst financial crisis.
I had to revise a textbook.
In other words, then, when the curtain inevitably drops on an inevitably terminal process, the best excuse he can come up with is that he went to refine a textbook which probably teaches a pack of lies, which lies he probably wasn't setting himself about rectifying. And the most refined perspective of regulation that he can come up with, therefore, is to disappear when all the fingers which are inevitably going to be pointed, inevitably, if they ever reach the root of the problem and the criminals at the bottom of this, those fingers would inevitably point at him.
His departure leaves the Fed board with 3 of its 7 seats vacant, just when the economy needs it most.
Imagine that. In the midst of terminal failure, a board of directors which couldn't save us from the consequences of the system unless they eradicated the system of terminal exploitation itself. Practically half of a board of governors of a system of terminal exploitation which cannot be saved from itself simply disappears.
Well, I'm sure your textbook is important and widely read, but in August of 2008, some somewhat more important things were going on in the world, don't you think?
Of course, we do have to appreciate the limited leverage of the interviewer here. But nonetheless, in reviewing this documentary, we need likewise at the same time to acknowledge how soft this question is. Necessarily soft because if we anger the person being interviewed here, of course they can simply terminate the interview, but or skew the remainder of their answers all the further. The thing is, this is what we're really doing here is we're asking questions about the petty lies and behavior and evasion, which comes down in the very end of this thing as a natural consequence of, if you will, at least of the ramifications of this same obfuscation of the currency. And yet we're not asking one single question about this. Why on earth are we not asking what capacity, if we want to ask soft questions, why don't we still get to the meat of the matter here? Why don't we ask what purpose did this person have serving on the board of governors of the purported Federal Reserve System? Further superficial questions would be, how did it get the name federal when it isn't federal? If it wasn't an intended deception, why did this happen? These are still superficial things. The question we really need to be asking, if we're asking soft questions, because this can be asked in an unoffensive way, is how Ben Bernanke or Hank Paulson or Paul Volcker or Alan Greenspan or Barack Obama or George W. Bush or Bill Clinton or George H.W. Bush or Ronald Reagan or Jimmy Carter or Gerald Ford, how is it possible, do you say, even to maintain a vital circulation subject to interest, without suffering these terminal consequences, if we can only do so by perpetually reborrowing principal as new debt equal to the old, which otherwise might be resolved, thus making it mathematically impossible to pay down the sum of debt, and what interest we have to reborrow as new debt, being as this new debt is above the former sum of debt, therefore increasing the former sum of debt by so much as perpetually ever greater sums of interest on an ever greater sum of debt. How is it then, in fact, that we could even maintain a vital circulation without suffering these consequences under this obfuscation? You see, there is no answer for this question, which I've been asking for over 40 years. They don't have it. This is why they avoid me. It can't be answered. In fact, if you created yourself computer models or examine the source code of mine or the Excel spreadsheets I've had online since the mid-1990s, if you'd ever done any of these things, which is just the elementary math of this process, you'd find out that by modeling that very process, you project the very debt that we would suffer at this time. So these are very soft questions. The first one you ask is how it's even possible to avoid all of these inevitable ramifications of this terminal system of exploitation, which is based on this obfuscation of the currency. And when they don't have an answer for that question, you have prepared behind it, as I have for so long, a further set of questions which gets at this obfuscation of the currency. Unless we do that, we're just playing games here. And an unfortunate thing about the lightness of all this is that without an understanding of the obfuscation and its only solution, we're going into a gun battle unarmed. These people can be as evasive can be, and yet they escape successfully because they haven't been pinned down to answer the most vital questions of all.
By Friday, September 12th, Lehman Brothers had run out of cash, and the entire investment banking industry was sinking fast. The stability of the global financial system was in jeopardy.
This is the very dangerous misunderstanding which I'm trying to avoid here in explaining this and in reviewing this documentary. The stability of the global, quote, financial system, unquote, isn't destroyed in the end by the collapse of one or two or however many, quote, investment banks, unquote. Hardly. Not at all. True, people would suffer losses which aren't even necessarily restricted, of course, to just the mere collapse of these however many, quote, investment banks, unquote. The collapse of the system is ensured from the very day that you allow a purported central bank to obfuscate our currency, to obfuscate our promissory obligations to each other, to launder the principal into their own possession when they've merely published the evidence of our obligations to each other, and then to multiply any and every initial debt into a terminal